Carl Zeiss is one of the most successful optics companies in the world, and they've been that for centuries. They've literally been making optical instruments like telescopes, microscopes, binoculars, those types of things for centuries. And when you're a company that's been around for a couple hundred years, you're bound to find yourself in a dust-up from time to time. In today's video, we're going to talk about the world-famous Carl Zeiss Optics Company, their involvement, and their culpability during World War II. During the middle of the 20th century, the world was engulfed by one of the largest military conflicts in history. History has judged the Axis powers to have largely been at fault for the conflict, and history has indicted the Nazi regime as one of the most horrific and cruel governments to ever exist. And as time has drawn on and some of these companies have continued to exist into the modern age, questions have frequently came up about who knew what when and what was the degree of involvement of each of these companies. In fact, many of the businesses that existed in Germany at the time are still with us today. To name a few: Audi, BMW, Mercedes, Bayer, Hugo Boss, and many, many others. But we are a photography channel here, after all, and one name that surprised me on that list was one Carl Zeiss. Unfortunately, Carl Zeiss was heavily involved in partnering with the Nazi regime during World War II. You can do a quick tour around Carl Zeiss's websites and any historical accounting, carefully tiptoe around the Nazi part of their history. They have done quite a good job whitewashing their image over time. One doesn't have to look far on YouTube to find videos out there praising the exceptional optical quality and craftsmanship of Carl Zeiss lenses. They are absolutely legendary, but there haven't been many videos at all that went into their involvement in World War II. I think it's safe to say, after doing some research and reading some resources, that Carl Zeiss Optics had a complicated relationship with the Nazi regime during World War II. I'm really going to break this video into two parts. The first part of the video is going to focus primarily on the products and the services that they offered to the Nazi government, and the second part of the video is going to involve the anti-Semitic forced labor that was utilized by many companies in Germany during the Second World War. Before World War II, Zeiss had focused on making interesting optical devices for civilians. They made telescopes, microscopes, planetarium projection devices, and obviously cameras and lenses, and much of that is what we're familiar with today. However, by 1937, the priorities of the German government were changing pretty dramatically as they began to overcome the economic sanctions and restrictions put on them by the West and started to shift their economy more into a war-making mode. In their factory in Dresden, where many of the civilian projects rolled off assembly lines, they were gradually discouraged in favor of products that would aid the military. At this point, the Carl Zeiss factory in Jena employed about 10,000 people. Zeiss Optics featured prominently in the success of many weapon systems. Some of these instruments included U-boat UDF targeting bearing transmitter binoculars, ultra-wide-angle large aperture binoculars, and also the stereoscopic rangefinders and sights used to direct devastating weapons such as the 88mm anti-tank guns. And in fact, one of the most published photos of World War II was one of the photographs that shows Adolf Hitler outside of Warsaw, Poland in September of 1939, looking through a pair of artillery director periscoping binoculars as the city is leveled by German artillery and air forces. So you can see there was kind of a common thread that ran through most of these products. They were products for the military, but they were kind of optical in nature. Most of the time it's binoculars, telescopes, aiming sights, those types of things that they had some expertise in. But these were goods produced specifically to aid the Nazi war-making machine. But perhaps worse than the military equipment that they produced for the Nazi armed forces, they also employed the use of forced labor. And I think at this point it's crucial to emphasize that during World War II, almost every company played some role in aiding the German war-making machine. And most of them did this against their will. This is an authoritarian dictatorship. I mean, think about it. There aren't that many ways to oppose an authoritarian government. But while many companies participated in the German efforts to make war, not all companies employed forced labor. And sadly, Carl Zeiss was one of those companies. And I think it's important to point out here that all of this happened almost 80 years ago. These companies have changed hands, their board of directors have changed, their CEOs have changed, their employees have changed, but that doesn't change that these stories need to be told and the history preserved. And much of the evidence here that we're going to be referring to came from the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos from 1933 to 1945, Volume 1. So the first concentration camp, subcamp, was utilized by Zeiss at the time, was a branch of the Flossenburg concentration camp. The formation of the subcamp by Zeiss was part of a plan to establish a series of armaments-related subcamps of Flossenburg in Dresden City, which is in eastern Germany. Flossenburg itself was a major concentration camp. About 100,000 prisoners passed through Flossenburg and its subcamps. And unfortunately, about 30,000 people died in the custody of the Germans in these camps, mostly from malnutrition, overwork, or just plain executions. And when we refer to these subcamps, we're referring to these outlying detention centers that came under the command of the SS under the Third Reich. And sadly, the conditions of these subcamps were oftentimes worse than those found in the main concentration camps. And this initial subcamp that was established by Zeiss under the Flossenburg concentration camp was not the only subcamp established by Zeiss. There was an additional subcamp established 2 weeks later. The goal of the Zeiss subcamps was to fulfill the needs of armaments production. As we pointed out earlier in the video, the war caused all the Zeiss Icon factories to switch over to making war-related products such as special devices for the German Luftwaffe. However, the Zeiss Icon subplant was planned from the beginning as a war plant, meaning that it had industrial buildings of steel-reinforced concrete, and they were bomb-proof with small windows and reinforced staircases. And this subcamp was dedicated mainly to munitions production, and they were established from 1940 to 1941. And let's talk some numbers here for a second. On October the 18th, 1944, 200 female workers were allocated to the Zeiss subcamp. On October 28th, 1944, an additional 300 women were brought from Auschwitz concentration camp to the Zeiss subcamp. And again, on December the 14th, 1944, 200 more women were brought. According to prisoner statements, the women at these subcamps were guarded by female SS guards who walked around with rubber batons. And according to those same statements, the female guards would routinely beat the prisoners with those batons. And some of the SS guards who worked at the subcamp were previous workers at the Zeiss factories. The women were housed on one level of the factory and worked 2 or 3 levels below. And a little bit more information on the second subcamp, the one we talked about previously, the one that was established 2 weeks after the initial Zeiss subcamp. Little is known about that subcamp, and that may be because there was no trial ultimately held about that subcamp, unlike the initial Zeiss subcamp. The camp evacuation took place in April of 1945 after the Allied occupation. Moreover, there was evidence that during the war between 1941 and 1945, Zeiss had used thousands of forced labor workers, which comprised about 30% of their entire workforce. And again, circling back to the distinction we made at the start of this video, I think it's important to distinguish between the companies that participated because they had no choice and companies like Zeiss that took advantage of the situation to utilize forced labor work. And that's not to say that there were no anecdotal examples of heroism inside the Zeiss factories, and it's certain that not all Germans were sympathetic to the Nazi Party. In fact, there are known examples of intervention from the Zeiss personnel department to obtain release of foreign labor workers. And some workers, while they were working at the factories, may warn a newcomer to watch what you say around certain people. After Nazi Germany declared war on the United States, the major German cities were bombed by medium and heavy bombers of the Allies, increasingly at will, with some raids specifically targeting Zeiss facilities. The city of Stuttgart, for example, was targeted in a series of 53 Allied air raids that commenced on the 25th of August 1940 and continued throughout the course of the war. The worst raids in 1944 obliterated the central district, while the Contessa factory in Henslach suffered only minor damage. Jena was never designated by the U.S. Air Force as a primary target. However, on the 8th of February 1945, Jena was approved as an alternative industrial secondary target. And because of the heavy bombing by the Allies at that point, it was likely not because of the military value of the Zeiss plants there or any particular reason like that. It's more likely because the other more primary targets had already been effectively bombed and were of no military value anymore. So Jena was bombed by the 8th U.S. Air Force several times late into the war, each time with increasing severity. There's evidence that the disruption of raw materials and transport were having some chain reaction effect at Zeiss facilities. However, like I said a second ago, it's important to distinguish between the companies that took part in the war because they had no choice and the companies that actually sought an advantage from the war-making situation. The Nazis abducted almost 12 million people from almost 20 European countries, and many of those workers ended up dying as a result of the conditions. At its peak, forced labor in Germany represented about 20% of the entire workforce of the country of Germany. According to reports of trials that ended up happening after the war, only a few workers ended up dying in Zeiss plants. Nevertheless, after the war, the company continued to grow and to prosper on into the years, whereas the forced laborers that were forced to work under the Nazi regime in the Zeiss factories were left with the mental scars and anguish of their time. Today, Carl Zeiss is a company with successful records and achievements regarding cinematography and photography, and I think at this point we would be remiss to forget just how much of Zeiss's success that it owes to the men and women who made unbelievable sacrifices by being forced into labor and to work in their factories. And a special credit to the website ymcinema.com for producing the original article that spawned this video from me. Much of the research in this video was done by that website, so check out their article when you get time. And if you thought this video was interesting, check out this video I made about contacts that involve some of the same time periods and a remarkable name brand. Check out this video I made about contacts. It involved many of the same time periods and also involved Carl Zeiss. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. See ya.